Point Blank is a crime fiction podcast. It may not be suitable for all listeners. We discuss violence in all its forms. The works we reference may include period slang, which some listeners may find offensive. The hosts also have a tendency to swear.
Episode 39, Blood of the Wicked, by Leighton Gage. All right, welcome back to Point Blank. Today we're continuing our discussion of Brazilian Noir and Blood of the Wicked. Joining me, as always, is Justin. Justin, your hands covered in blood today.
Yes, they are.
Well, I'm glad to see nothing has changed.
Mm-hmm.
That's right, Kurt and Justin always covered in blood. Just the blood of the wicked, though, Justin.
Yeah, only the blood of the wicked.
Well, folks, we're here to talk about Blood of the Wicked. Before we do that, Justin, do you have anything you'd like to talk about?
No, I'm pretty cool. It's just an early winter day, and I smell delicious food cooking in the kitchen. I want to eat. That's what I'm thinking about right now. So I know that you have some things you'd like to talk about, though.
Sure. First of all, I wanted to thank some of our listeners for providing some reviews for the show on iTunes. We really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yes, and I wanted to read just because we don't always mention who they are, but this time we will. We got a review from someone going by Mr. B, and this simply says, there aren't many podcasts that cover crime, noir, hard-boiled fiction out there, and this one may be the best. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah. We also got another nice review from someone going by Brooklynly Man 540. Surprisingly here, we actually got some feedback about the show, so I thank you for that. The two pieces of feedback in this review are to take calls from listeners and to interview authors. And we've sort of discussed doing some interviews in the past, but it is hard enough for Justin and I to get the time that works out for both of us to record. So it might be a while before we do any author interviews on the show. I do have one idea that I am toying with that might be a way to bring some authors on the show, but I'm gonna wait and talk to Justin about that before we make any kind of announcement.
We've thought about these things, and they are possible, and there are ways to make them work. But like Kurt said, we have both have very irregular schedules. But it's something we can think about over the winter, Kurt. We can talk about what we might do to spruce things up as we approach episode 50 in the coming year.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a goal for both of us, is maybe around that episode 50 mark, making some changes at that point, because, hey, 50 episodes, that's a lot. That's enough to reflect on maybe changing up the format a little bit. I did want to suggest that if you do want to record a question or a comment for the show, we don't necessarily have a phone number that would work for that, but if you recorded a short piece of audio and sent us that via email, that's certainly something that, we could try to work into the show.
Yeah.
If you had a question, that'd be great. You could send that to our email address at pointblanknoir@gmail.com, and we can try to incorporate that into the show.
Totally. We'd be happy to do that. That'd be easy to splice into a show.
Very easy to do. So, listeners, if you do have questions, comments, book recommendations, hey, if you got a review you want to give us, we could certainly do that. The other thing I wanted to cover today, and I mentioned this on the last episode, and I'm super excited about this game I've been playing. It's Disco Elysium. It is a computer role-playing game. You might say, well, that doesn't sound particularly detective-y, but this is definitely a detective game, and I have to say, it's so far, one of the best games I've played on a computer in a very long time.
Wow.
Yeah, this came from a small Estonian developer. They've been working on it for a number of years, and it's comparable. If you're a computer gamer and you played these old school role-playing games, it's comparable in my mind to games like Baldur's Gate, Planescape Torment, or the original Fallout games. And if those things mean anything to you, you know that those are some of the best computer role-playing games ever made. And this one just happens to be a detective game. It does take place in a world that it's Earth-like, but it's definitely not Earth. It's called Disco Elysium, but the time frame is like sort of this mashup of 50s and 70s and maybe even a little cyberpunk and steampunk sort of all meshed into almost a dream world. The setting sort of invokes things like maybe Kafka-esque, David Lynch, China Mayville, that kind of a setting. And the writing is solid. The choices really make a difference. And the first thing you do is you wake up naked in your hotel room and you have to find your clothes. And I'll give you a hint that you can actually die trying to put your clothes on in this opening scene of the game. But it is very dystopian, and you are the disheveled detective who has lost his memory and has been sent to this town to solve this crime of this body that's hanging in a tree behind your hotel. You find all of this out in the opening minutes of the game, so I'm not really giving anything away here. But it really is a great detective game, and the skills in this game also are unlike anything I've played before, where you have essentially this mind palace, and your various skills that you use, which can be crazy, affect the game. For example, if you become super smart in this game, the game starts spewing out like encyclopedic entries on the various things that you're seeing. Whereas if you become more strong in the game, your choices of how you resolve situations are going to become more physical and less mental. What I would do is, if this isn't at all interesting to you, go on YouTube, check out like one of the shorter, like a 5 or a 10-minute review of the game, and just see if this is the kind of detective story you might be interested in playing as a game. It really is narratively driven. Choices matter. The writing and game world are just excellent, and I think you won't be disappointed in that experience. So that's Disco Elysium.
Wow, that sounds pretty complicated, pretty intense, and like in terms of world building, that seems pretty advanced.
It is complex, and that might be a turnoff for some people. That's why I would recommend looking at one of these videos. It is, I think, for some people, this world setting might come across as a bit pretentious and kind of a little, I don't want to say too cerebral, but maybe it gets too involved in itself. But if that isn't a turnoff to you, then I think you'll like this game.
It sounds way more complex than Qbert, which I'm very good at.
Yeah, this is just Qbert with a detective hat.
Detective Qbert.
Hey, if they can make Detective Pikachu, I don't know. That's
true. There's a whole genre.
So, yeah, that's what I've been playing, outside of reading crime fiction. That's what I've been up to. Anything else you've been up to, Justin?
Every once in a while, I look at LA Noir, which sits in a box, and I go, well, I should play that. Maybe this year. That's as far as I've gotten.
That was a good one. I played it when it came out, but I even bought the remastered version, and I couldn't get myself to play it again. I think it's kind of a play it once and you're good kind of experience.
Gotcha. I just have to play it once then.
There you go.
I'm really bad at playing games. I talk myself out of it on a regular basis.
These days, I'm a lot better at following the gaming media than I am at actually playing any games. So, For example, I know at one point in this show, we talked up Red Dead Redemption, and I have to say, even though I got into Red Dead Redemption 2 for, I don't know, a while, when I had to pause and do other things, I wasn't compelled to go back to it.
Well, that's what weird schedules, the kind of havoc they wreak.
Yes. Well, we're not here to talk about games. We're here to talk about crime fiction, and we're continuing our discussion of Blood of the Wicked by Leighton Gage. So, Justin, would you like to hit us with a little more in-depth summary this time around?
Sure. Let me give you a brief intro before we dive deep. So this book, Blood of the Wicked, published in 2008 by Soho Crime, first offering by Leighton Gage's crime fiction series featuring Chief Inspector Mario Silva. It's a violent book, it's politically charged, and it's a crime thriller that's set in Brazil's Sao Paulo state, which is the greater, more rural state in which Sao Paulo, which is a massive megacity, resides. Now, Silva, he's our protagonist, and he's the series detective. But he doesn't spend as much time on the page in this book as you might expect. He's a federal police officer. He's based in Sao Paulo, but the story that we read is actually set in a small town or maybe a small city of Cascatas do Pontal. And Silva is tasked with going to this city to investigate the assassination of a bishop named Dom Felipe Antunes. His second in command is actually his nephew, and he goes by Hector Costa. And he's there in Cascatas with Silva, along with another guy named Arnaldo Nunes. And we also get, on occasion, some dialogue between Silva and his boss in Sao Paulo on the phone. And the dynamic between the boss and Silva and these two other detectives is reminiscent to me of Red Harvest, which I mentioned in the previous episode. The way the Continental Op and his two operative pals shake up the city and try to work as a team to, roost the criminals and solve the crime. And I wonder if that was something that Gage did intentionally, evoke Harvest or not. We can't know with certainty because Mr. Gage has passed. In terms of the plot, it's pretty straightforward. Silva is a stranger and he comes to town. And that town is Cascatas, and in the wake of the assassination of the bishop, it's hard to tell who the main players are, let alone who the main suspects are. But we get to them over the course of the novel. Of course, it gets pretty perplexing as the characters begin to stack up. And Jesus, are there a lot of characters in this book? Let's start with the crooked cop, Colonel Ferez. Right off the bat, he's a bad guy. In the previous episode, Kurt mentioned how you can almost imagine him twirling his mustache like a classic villain. And yes, I got that impression as well. We also have the local Catholic leadership, led by Father Angelo, who's sort of, hard to tell what his motive is here and what his play is on the whole thing. He tends to play things coyly. We also have another Catholic priest who goes by Father Brower, who's a little bit more of a lefty. He comes from the Liberation Theology camp, has an affinity for the landless peasants, and has worked with the poor. So there's some ideological stuff happening here that we'll talk plenty about in our deep discussion. Speaking of the Landless Workers League, which is based on the landless workers movement in real life, they play a role in the town of Cascatas. They are fighting for land, and there are plenty of landowners that would rather this league disappear. So, does the Landless Workers League have a hand in assassinating this bishop who was not their friend? Or perhaps the landless or the landowners movement, led by a wealthy industrialist Orlando Munoz, were they the ones who assassinated the bishop in order to set up the workers to justify mass repression? On top of all these potential players, we have local reporter Diane Poli, and also there's a well-known TV journalist who shows up later in the story to come and shed light on the issue. These women meddle in some dangerous waters, competing with very male forces, and we'll learn pretty quickly that their fates are sealed in ways that you might expect in a book where serious misogyny rules the day. There's a lot to unpack in this novel, like I said, all these characters, but let's focus on Silva. Is he an interesting character, and does he lead the charge in this novel? He's definitely a character I want to know better, and we do get a lot of backstory about him to try to establish him as the series character. We learn that his father was killed by a local criminal in Sao Paulo, and his mother was raped in the same crime, and he seeks vengeance, and in this backstory, he acquires it. It doesn't really play into our plot very much, but it sets the tone for who he is and where he comes from. Mostly this is about the corrupt and the righteous, who's who, what's what, and a lot of it is born from real-life tensions in the social problems of modern Brazil post-military dictatorship. As pressure builds around the case, it's not surprising that bodies start to pile up, and man do they. We get a lot of killings, we get a lot of torture, a lot of rape, a lot of real horrific violence that's almost humorous at times because it's so gratuitous. Sometimes it felt very pulpy, which Kurt's mentioned, and depends on who you are and what you're looking for. This could be your thing, maybe not. Sometimes I felt they went a little bit overboard. The verdict was that although I didn't love the writing very much, I did like the plot, and I thought the themes raised in the text were pretty cool. I do like when writers carefully delve into social problems to reveal issues beyond simply telling a good yarn. This is another crime book where violence against women is spotlit, and violence against the poor, and ways that power are used to control certain classes. I like the sense of place. I very much feel like we're in Brazil in this book. And I like that we have a series detective, but I really wish that Silva actually did more. He doesn't do that much in this book, and we'll talk about that. I give this story 3.75 hits. Not quite 4, but good enough to be above a 3.5. So that's where I'm at right now. What do you think, Kurt?
Yeah, as we discussed in the last episode, I'm going to stick with that 3.75 as well.
Cool.
And I think that's a fair rating for this book. There's things I liked, there's things I disliked. And there were actually times when I was reading this that I was actually somewhat frustrated that we had picked it. But there was other times where I was like, man, this is pretty good. It's a mixed bag of a book, but one that I'm still glad that we read and glad that I would recommend if someone was interested in especially the themes of this book, or were looking for something for Brazil. So I think that 3.75 is very fair. I would have liked a little more consistency in the book, one way or the other. We're going to get into some of that. Overall, an enjoyable book and one that I'm glad we read.
Fair enough. It's fun that we agree on the number. I wasn't expecting that. We do have plenty of characters to think about as we move into some of the specifics.
Oh boy.
Yeah, let me read you a list of, and these aren't secondary. These are all important characters. So let me just run through the names. We have, obviously, Mario Silva. He's our protagonist. We have Hector Costa, his nephew. We have Arnaldo Nunes, their associate. We have Nelson Sampaio, their boss. We have Diane Poli, the reporter. We have the other reporter, whose name I don't even have here. We have Colonel Emerson Perez, the bad cop. We have Orlando Munoz Sr., the national president of the Landowners Association. We have his son, Orlando Munoz Jr. We have Luis Pilar, the leader of the Landless Workers League. We got Father Gaspar Farias, who meets with Costas early on. We have Euclides, who's his watchdog and protector. We have Father Anton Brouwer from Belgium, who's sort of like the lefty priest. And that's not everybody. Those are just the main players that we keep seeing over and over again as the plot wheel tightens. It was hard to follow at times, at least for me. I don't know if you had that same experience, Kurt.
Yes, is the simple answer. It is. It's quite a cast of characters, and I think that's one of the things where when I'm saying that it could have used a little more consistency. Actually, removing some of these characters might have it been a little bit better story. Did we need 2 journalists?
No.
Maybe not. Did we need as many priests? Maybe not.
Yeah.
Did we need as many landowners? Maybe not. Did we need as many workers, landless peasant movement people? Maybe not. It wasn't so bad that I really lost the thread of the plot, but it was just confusing enough that I had to go, wait a minute, who's this again? And for this style and this length of book, that was unnecessary. I mean, this isn't Game of Thrones, for gosh sakes.
No, I mean, it's really a simple plot. When I said a stranger comes to town and tries to solve a mystery. Somebody was assassinated, and there's some obvious bad guys, and there's some obvious people who are in a gray area. And so I never felt at the start that I was like, oh, wow, this is a real classic whodunit. I have no clue. I got a sense early on who the prime candidates were. So there was not too much sleight of hand going on here, which raised the question of why so many damn characters, and perhaps because Gage was starting off and trying to capture the real complications of a situation like this.
I'm going to go ahead and contradict myself here and say that I'm guessing what Gage might have been trying to do, and this is from those interviews that I saw of him, is to give a better cross-section or a better sample of the diversity of Brazil. To say that just because there is a clergy doesn't mean all the clergy believe the same thing. Just because there's one particular group. And I can see that, but maybe he did a little too much of that in this particular book.
Yeah, I understand that logic. He didn't, and especially being not a native of Brazil, he probably wanted to tread carefully and make sure not. Sure. He can either oversell and add too much to it, or he could underdo it, and maybe he erred on the side of being a little more inclusive, so as not to oversimplify a place that isn't. I would give him shit if he provided a book that was hyper simplistic. So I can understand the difficulties of an American expat, treading in these waters.
It would be interesting to see if we, were to read book 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever, to see if it would have the same complexity, or if he had boiled it down a little bit and found more of the nuance with a smaller cast of characters, but more time to devote on each character.
I don't have many characters here that I'm like eager to dive in and spend a lot of time with, but the biggest issue I had or concern or confusion I had was with Mario Silva and Hector Costa, because Mario Silva is most certainly our chief protagonist. The series, is about him. But and I didn't realize this right away when I was reading, but we set him up early on to go out to Cascatas to solve this crime. But before he actually arrives there, we're spending a lot of time with Hector Costa, who's already there, interviewing people and being like the detective, being the guy who's out and about doing this stuff. And I got confused. I was like, wait a second, this isn't Mario. What's happening? And it was sort of scratching my head trying to figure out what the logic was with Gage having these two detectives doing a very similar role. Why not just have the one detective, was my thought. Why not develop this guy and see him on the ground doing the stuff? Did you have that issue, or was that just a Justin thing?
I can see what you're getting at. I don't think I had quite as big a problem with it. I think in part here, because Gage is acknowledging the level of corruption in the Brazilian police, which is obvious and a fact, I think he had to go with a main character who had the position and therefore the power to actually not be stepped on by somebody higher up the chain, right?
Sure.
And normally we see our feet on the ground detective that we have is maybe not low ranked, but kind of in the middle somewhere, right? In this case, we have a guy who's one of the highest ranked federal police officers in the country. So he's going to have a team. He's going to have people who are doing the footwork for him, because that's not necessarily his job anymore. And so having that, I don't want to call him necessarily a sidekick or an underling, but having that character doing his legwork kind of makes sense to me, and it kind of establishes that Silva is a little bit higher in position than our average detective.
Yeah, I guess I could see that. I don't know if that adds to the book. I don't know if that helps, but I could see the role of Hector being sort of a lower level detective, so that the power plays and the power dynamics between him and the folks he interviews will be different, a little bit less subservient, and people will think that they could take advantage or work around him or play games with him in a way that they might not feel enabled to do with somebody as high ranking as Silva.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know. Again, that's, maybe that's a thing that irons itself out a little bit in future books. But you're right. I mean, it is a little odd to start a series book with a detective who is not our main character, or supposed to be our main character.
Yeah, a little weird. How about this menagerie of characters? Does anybody stand out to you as particularly charming or memorable or unique?
Well, I mean, I think for me the obvious answer is the two priests who are the more the ones who are doing the field work with the poor and the landless workers movement, and that's Father Angelo and Father Anton Brower. I mean, I think there's kind of supposed to be, I don't know, hero isn't quite the right word, but they're supposed to be the characters that we feel the most connection to, and I think that works. I mean, they're given the most other than Silva, perhaps, they're given the most backstory, the most we're shown the biggest range of their emotion and motivations and stuff like that, and they have an interesting backstory. I mean, their choices in this book are backed up with an experience that we've been told in the narrative, and that makes a lot of sense. And in the problem I do have with this huge cast of characters, other than it just getting a little complicated, is that so many of them are essentially a cliche, and I do think that's problematic in points. I don't necessarily have a problem with the Ferez, the police colonel, being such a obviously villainous character from the get-go, because he is a terrible person. I mean, he leads a death squad and tortures people. We shouldn't like him.
Yes. And you never get any complexity with him. It's just very much, he likes to torture people. He is inspired by the military dictatorships torturing. He never contemplates his choices. He's clearly just a straight up psychopath.
Yeah, and I feel like you see some of this too with, I mean, the landowner is, there's not a lot of nuance there. Both you have the rich landowner with the troublesome son who gets murdered pretty much as soon as he enters the book. You know, that's a very stereotyped rich guy character.
Yep. Boss hog.
Yeah, exactly. And you see the same thing to a degree with the more mainstream priests in their position. And of course, the moment we meet Father Gaspar, I mean, he comes across as slimy from the get-go. That turns out to be true. And even the members of the landless peasants movement, you know, Pilar, and who's like the national leader, and then the local leaders, I mean, they kind of come across as fairly stereotypical as well.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily have a problem with that, although based on the type of novel and the key part of the storyline that narrative plays, I would have liked to have spent a little more time with those characters rather than having them just make sort of a cameo appearances in various scenes. The stereotype I really find problematic is that of the journalists.
Yeah. I was waiting for that.
Yeah, and I don't know how much I really want to spend on this, but I really have a problem with Gage going ahead and having actually there's two stereotypes here that come through in the fiction that are problematic for me. The first is the journalists, both of whom are female. Both of them are, you know, in their own ways, they're both powerful females who are trying to get at the root of the story and doing way more legwork than, frankly, our Chief Inspector Silva is doing.
Yeah.
And for their efforts, they both end up raped and murdered.
Yeah. And they're the only two characters who are women in the story. They both have power, and that power is absolutely and undeniably destroyed in this book. And yeah, I was just like, interesting choices.
So I do find that problematic. And, you know, I get, to a certain degree, I get it, because those methods were certainly employed by the military dictatorship in Brazil. Brazil has been and continues to be a very dangerous place to be a reporter. It's quite frequent that reporters, particularly ones who report on the types of issues brought up in this book, are assassinated. That happens. That is truth. But to have that be your only female characters in the book, I find a little bit problematic. I also, and this is sort of connected to the same idea of, I guess, sexualized characters in the book, it's that we also have a priest who turns out is a pedophile, but that's also the only gay character in the book. So, of course, the gay character is also a pedophile, and the women, one of whom is a lesbian, those characters are raped and killed. So
yeah,
one of those would be like, oh, seems like a bad choice. But to throw all three of those into me, it kind of throws up a little bit of a red flag and makes me a little bit uncomfortable. The saving part of all of this, though, is that I'm not sure if Gage, how conscious he was that he was making that choice, because there's a lot of other things that he includes in here that I give him credit for including in the book. So, you know, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm mixed on it too. It wasn't glaring. I remember reading out and at the end seeing, while I could understand maybe as a woman why she might have crafted Carino that final explosive, violent, rapey conclusion. This, I feel like there are some bad moves, but there's so much going on in this story. It wasn't as consistently glaring, though I don't want to drag it out, I think, because it wasn't the centerpiece of the book in the same way that that issue was in Out. It wasn't a primary feature to a main character. So I don't think that there are any other characters I really want to chat about. I think they'll come up as they come up over the course of the story, though I do agree with you about the priests and the discussions that Gage brings to our attention through these characters, such as the discussions on liberation theology and what it was and what it is, and how it was so controversial at this time in relation to the MST, the movement, and the bishop and the Catholic Church. And I actually read an interview with him talking about these issues, and somebody asks him pretty much straight up. In the online journal Crime Scraps, the interviewer is talking to Gage and says that Blood of the Wicked is a perfect example of crime fiction being used as an educational resource, and asks if Gage thinks it's his role as a writer to educate through his stories. And Gage says, no, that's not the purpose, and that's not the primary function of my stories, and it shouldn't be. People don't buy novels to be educated, they buy them to be entertained. So his goal was to write a good story first and to educate or fill people in on interesting information second. And it was good to hear him say that, because it means he was conscious of that. Though I did think about that once in a while as I was reading, how much of this was a mission by him to discuss Brazil's social problems versus prioritizing the story. Did you think about that reading the book?
Yeah, I certainly did. And I thought about it again after seeing an interview with him that I mentioned earlier. I don't know. He seems to change his point of view a little bit on that, because in that interview, he did seem to maybe not say that, the book was trying to teach a lesson, a morality lesson or anything like that, but that it was there to educate people about Brazil and issues going on in Brazil. That might be two different things, because you have to have some material to tell your story. So why not put information in there which is going to be interesting? He makes a comparison. I didn't think about this until afterwards, but there are some comparisons to what he's trying to do in some of the things that we've seen in, say, Nordic noir, where we're getting a crime story, but we're also learning some actual facts as well.
Yeah.
Now, you have to dig a little bit more, I think, with Gage, and be a little careful of the facts that he's giving, maybe more so than a lot of Nordic noir that I've read. But there is some similarities there. If you didn't know anything about Brazilian politics, you would certainly learn something in this book while you were reading it.
Absolutely. He's trying to shed light on structural issues that plague or affect Brazil, and a lot of the themes of this book are very much about those things. You want to talk briefly about some of the themes, Kurt?
I think a topic is definitely this idea of liberation theology and how that has affected, all of South America, really, and Central America, starting, correct me if I'm wrong here, Justin, but I think that started in the 50s.
Yeah, I forgot the name of the person. Somebody put out a doctrine on liberation theology. It was a Peruvian priest named Gustavo Gutierrez.
And it really takes more precedence in gains wider appeal into the 60s and 70s and as well into the 80s. But it is a theology, and I'm no expert on the Catholic Church, but it takes Christian and Catholic teachings and applies some elements. There's debate. Some people would say that this is incorporating ideas of Marxism. Others say, no, this is actually going back to the origins of the Christian church and the teachings of Jesus, that the real function of the church is to provide for the poor with land, with I guess today we'd probably also be saying healthcare, those sorts of things, making those basic needs of people, that should be the primary function of the church. Now, in the history of liberation theology, I was doing some reading on this, and I think Gage elevates the story of liberation theology a little bit. He sensationalizes it a little bit. He makes a reference to some priest who died in the jungles as part of a guerrilla movement with 2 guns in his hand and something like that. And I was trying to find that. I didn't necessarily see that. I mean, it might be true.
But he also acknowledges Romero's assassination in El Salvador in the late 70s, early 80s, which was a pivotal moment, sort of a realization moment of just who the bad guys and the good guys were in the El Salvador Civil War. So some factual truths and maybe some slippery sensationalizing. I agree.
But at the root of it is this idea of liberation theology it's one of socioeconomic justice, and it's through the lens of the Catholic Church. And you can see why that type of theology could stir some people up. Sure. There's going to be some things that the people may not want to hear. Like a lot of things of the Bible and religious philosophy, it can often be seen through the eyes of the beholder or the reader, and you can put your own spin on it. In this case, a lot of the people who believed in liberation or do believe in liberation theology see the teachings of the Christian church as matching up with with those of the ideas of liberation theology. It's still a big thing. I mean, at the time of the publishing of this book, there was some talk about how, these priests had, I mean, I don't exactly think it's excommunication, but it's essentially excommunication from the church, that some of the prominent priests had been removed from the church back in 85. And I saw a relatively recent article, I want to say 2008 maybe. This is under Pope Francis, had reinstated them, and that Pope Francis was considered to be more open-minded to some of the ideas of liberation theology than previous popes have been. And part of that might be that Brazil has one of the largest populations of Catholic worshipers in the world. I saw one statistic that there was maybe as many as 1 million reading groups that essentially meet in Brazil and read scripture from a point of view of liberation theology. So that's quite a lot of people.
It's very interesting. And it brings to mind Paulo Freire, the pedagogist who is known for writing critical pedagogy and writing pedagogy of the oppressed. He's also from Brazil, and I think a lot of that document, that text is reminiscent of liberation theology. It's a way of rethinking the way we go about our faith and what should have priority, just in the same way that education needs to be rethought of as a tool for the oppressed to overcome their chains. You could conflate it with Marxism, or you can look at it as simply, hey, this is about the underdogs, and all of these things we're trying to think about all these social problems in a new way. Maybe we're looking at these things through the wrong lens. And in this book, and that's the key to this book, to the plot itself, is that the Catholic Church did not like liberation. They thought it was threatening to them, to the power structure, because it is. It threatens to undo a lot of the traditions that make the Catholic Church so damn powerful. So in the book, it was pretty much outlawed. The only people who are going to support lib theology are the outlaw priests or pastors. We have the Pastor Brouwer, who plays a major role as the plot evolves. And we have this conservative folks, including the bishop who gets assassinated, and Gaspar, the Pastor Gaspar early in the book, who is the gateway, one of the first conversations that Hector has when he's on the ground in the town of Cascada. So we start to see this tension between the two sides and what they can say and what they cannot say, because you're not allowed to openly talk about the issue. It's an interesting ride to see how each of these particular individuals navigates this difficult political and very real Brazilian struggle.
That really, how do you navigate these issues is a big part of this book, because that's just one of the themes that we've talked about here, is this idea of liberation theology. And when you have a movement that is dealing with issues of religion, property ownership, and the state, you're opening up a pretty big can of worms there, and
Sure.
dealing with pretty powerful forces. So, and let's move on just here. I mean, not that liberation theology is still connected to this other movement, but one of the other themes is dealing with this idea of the landless workers movement, which is in fact a real thing. There are a number of different movements in Brazil, but the biggest one of those is the landless workers movement, or Movimento dos Trabalhadores Sem Terra, or we'll say MST.
Yeah.
And they have a membership of, at least, as of recently, they had a membership of 1.5 million people across 23 of Brazil's 26 states. So it's a big movement. And that's just one of several. I believe in college, at least once, heard a speaker who was doing a tour in the United States speaking about the landless workers movement, and it's quite a major movement. It's one that it becomes complicated because they have a legal, in their eyes, and probably the eyes of many people, they have a legal right to reclaim unused arable land that these major landowners are holding on to, and it's in the Brazilian, it's in the Constitution.
Yeah.
And when they try to assert or make the government follow the law, that has brought about great repression from the government. And I'm not exactly, I wouldn't pretend to understand Brazilian law, but it is interesting to me that how do you have something in your constitution that they seem to somewhat regularly lose these land occupations, and they have turned violent, but not quite to the degree, again, that Gage, he makes it sound like almost every one of these engagements, people are ending up dead. When I was reading, briefly skimming the history, there's definitely been people murdered as part of this landless workers movement, but most of the time that doesn't happen. There's been some, fairly minor property destruction and things like that, not to the degree that Gage suggests.
Just to provide a little more factual basis to this, the Constitution of Brazil in 1988 is what they're, at least in the thing I read, the MST models their argument off of. It contains a passage that says that land should fulfill a social function, and therefore the MST has a right to occupy unproductive land. And according to 1996 census statistics in Brazil, 3% of the population owns 2/3 of all the arable land in Brazil. So there's a whole bunch of land, oftentimes unused, just sitting there for people who want to eventually maybe make a profit off of it. Meanwhile, there are thousands, millions of poor rural workers, the kind of folks who end up going to the city and living in favelas because there's no other choice for them. And they're saying, well, we could simply fix that by taking over this unused land that rich people are not making any use of and turning it into something functional and for the community. So if you look at it as just a basic, well, that makes sense to share this, but obviously it's an issue that raises questions of power, and it raises questions of capitalism, and it brings up questions of socialism as being a social good. Of course, those types of questions can very often lead to power being asserted by those in charge and military dictatorships, making sure that kind of change never happens. Bolsonaro right now is in part some of the consequences of that kind of thinking. So Brazil isn't out of the water yet. We're not talking about the past here. A lot of the themes that Gage discusses in this book, which came out in the late 90s or the early 2000s, is very much still a reality in Brazil
For sure.
today.
And, the things like the MST, depending on who's in office, they can have a very different relationship with the government. And I believe currently they're actually considered a terrorist organization of some variety because of the... not really because of physical violence to other people, but because of their positions on property and our sort of ridiculous definitions of terrorism incorporating that. So
That's
so it's a complicated and continuing issue. So that's just two of the themes in this book: liberation theology and the Brazilian. And I don't necessarily feel like we need to spend a lot of time on the other themes, but if that wasn't enough, Gage also throws in the idea of child prostitution, drug running.
It's almost as if he thought, well, if I'm going to have to write one book, I'm going to put every possible thing about Brazil that I know. We don't have a World Cup championship in this book, so that's a good thing. But just about everything. We don't have a rainforest destruction either. He could have added those two things, but I think he covered almost everything else.
It sure seems like that.
He does a fairly good job with much of it. So I give him credit.
Yeah, I do too, because I think the sloppy answer here would have been to just deal with an issue like drug running or child prostitution and call that good. But really to bring in this complicated issue of land use, land reform, and liberation theology is really kind of what sets this book apart from other potential books out there.
That's what I really loved about this book. And if I were to walk away from this book and go, what makes me want to read more Gage, it would definitely be his devotion to those topics and exploring those political things that can get real muddy real quick in a crime novel. And I think, although it's a little ham-fisted at times and a little bit sensationalist, he does, I think, a fair job of talking about these issues that I have a personal interest in. And it makes me want to see what he does in his future works. I know he has several books in this series. He passed away in 2013, so I'm not sure at that point if he had wrapped up the series or where he was. I'm not sure if you read anything about that.
I don't think he had wrapped up the series, but I do believe the last book that was published after his death. So I'm not sure how long he knew he was dealing with cancer or not. So it's possible he had a chance to conclude the series, but I don't know.
I will say a couple of things briefly before I feel personally satisfied about our discussion. I thought the plot was solid for being so many characters. I didn't feel lost, and I feel like he knew where he was going, and he kept the reader mostly on track. So I'll give him credit for that. But the one thing that I remember struggling with My Sister, the Serial Killer, by Braithwaite in Lagos is that the setting was missing. I wasn't feeling Lagos as much as I would have liked. Definitely not the case here. We were very much in Brazil in this book, dealing with Brazil themes, dealing with Brazil landscapes, dealing with the setting of Cascatas, which was like a hot, dusty town. And I sort of got the sense of the grit and all those good things that I look for in the fiction of the marginalized, which is crime fiction to me. I like that. I thought the setting was solid.
Despite my concerns about certain parts getting a little convoluted, I think the plot works. It does. The plot doesn't necessarily get lost as long as you can follow the characters. I definitely agree with you that this book gives you place. I mean, there's very few other places that you could have written this same story. It almost has to be from Brazil, and that is definitely in its favor.
If there's a legacy, I can't say that there's a massive legacy, but if we were to walk away and go, well, what did Gage do? Well, he brought attention to some interesting issues in a crime book that was pretty entertaining, and he was true to the place. I think that was one of his goals, and I think it was a goal he accomplished.
I can't disagree with that. So it was enjoyable to read Blood of the Wicked.
Cinema Spotlight! Woo! All right, I'm trying out a new voice for Cinema Spotlight. There it is.
I've got some popcorn.
Okay, eat that popcorn. I have a whole leg of lamb and 7 bowls of Skittles.
Wow.
Okay, so the film I review today is City of God, which is directed by Fernando Meirelles and Katja Lund. I'm not sure if you've seen this film, Kurt, have you?
I have. I have not rewatched it in a very long time.
Okay. This came out in 2003 worldwide, but it was released in Brazil in 2002. And it's based on a 1997 book by Braulio Mantovani, which I haven't read, so I can't speak to it. But this film, when it came out, I was in love with it. It was my first gateway to understanding the gritty underbelly of Brazil, so there's that. It was also really exciting story, really well crafted and real good cinematography. It's a rags to riches story, essentially, about organized crime coming to bear in the City of God favela in Rio de Janeiro. And it starts with the pre-crime boyhoods of 3 characters, Rocket, Lil Zay, and Benny. And as the story progresses into the 1970s, 2 of these 3 kids grow up to be local crime bosses. And our narrator, Rocket, becomes a photographer who flits in and out of the crime bosses' lives. They all live in the same place, and they got that boyhood connection. But they start to grow apart as power and other things, sex, drugs, and rock and roll get in the way. It's a really exciting, it's got a definite 90s feel. It feels of the time. It's filmed in the streets of Rio using mostly amateur actors. A lot of them are actually from the City of God favela, which is a real place. Only one of the actors is an actual professional. When I found that out, I was like, fuck, man, because it's really good. Like, there's real, genuine acting here. And the director said that a lot of the reason for that is because if they brought in professionals or middle-class Brazilians, they really were afraid they weren't going to get the true feel. They were going for authenticity. So favela spirit was really captured, and that's what they were going for. It's a fun, exciting, violent story about friendship, loyalty, power, beautiful cinematography. I've seen the film 6 times, and I've loved it every time. If you want to see a slightly sensationalized taste of the Brazilian favela life in the mid-1970s, which happens during the dictatorship, this is your film. It's highly recommended. Check it out. It's a nice companion to the book we discussed today.
I haven't seen the film in a long time, Justin, but I did watch one of those short recap YouTube things last night, and boy, I kind of want to watch it again now that we've had a chance to read about Brazilian crime fiction.
It definitely holds its own.
All right. Well, moving on to our last segment, 5-Round Burst. 5-Round Burst is where we do 5 short reviews of crime fiction. And I'll start off with a couple. All of mine are connected to Brazilian crime fiction. Woo! And I've mentioned a couple of these, but this is a little bit more information for you. First up is Whatever Happened to Dulce Viega. This is by Chao Fernando.
I don't know. I'm terrible at Portuguese.
Yeah. Abreu, and this is from 2000. This was published by the University of Texas Press. This is the one I mentioned that is somewhat dreamlike an exploration of the character's past as he travels through the present. This is about a washed-up reporter who lands a new job as a music reporter. He's definitely been in the music scene for a long time. He's apparently well-known. And his first assignment is to cover an up-and-coming punk rock group called Marcina, Fellatio, and the Toothed Vaginas. Yes. The lead singer provides new leads on a musician that our reporter once was infatuated with. She wasn't exactly well known, but she was like a cult icon. And she disappeared, I believe it was 20 years ago, prior to when this takes place. And what follows is a quest of obsession as our reporter searches for the lost Viega. It's an exploration of lost youth, sexuality, and a path into the dream world, all sort of blended into a journalistic detective story. And it's a short novel, and I enjoyed it, but if you were to read this, what I would strongly recommend you do is go to the end of the book, and this is a layout problem here that the press should have done, in my opinion. There is an essay and some explanations of various aspects of Brazilian myth, folklore, and whatnot. And when you read that, elements of, especially the dreamlike elements of this story, make a lot more sense. And had I read that first, I think I would have gotten a lot more out of this particular novel. It is one that explores the issue of AIDS in Brazil, the music scene in Brazil, and touches on elements of sex and sexuality, as well as being something of a critique of LGBT history in Brazil. So if any of those things are interesting to you, you might get more out of this novel. This is one I'm glad I read, but I think I don't want to call it a miss, but just be aware that this is something of a difficult novel to read. So that's Whatever Happened to Dulce Vega.
Intense.
It was, yes. Next up, we have The Silence of the Rain, and we mentioned this one before as well. This is by Luis Alfredo Garcia Rosa, and this is from 2002, published in the U.S. by Picador Press. Here we have what starts out as something of a standard police procedural, and I think it gets much better by the second half of the book. We start with a suicide by a rich businessman. But there's a twist. He leaves cash and a note for the police in the car, and he's trying to bribe the police to make it look like murder. But before the police can get this bribe and note, a low-life street hood finds the note and takes the note, the money, and the gun. Now enters our series detective, Detective Espinoza. He is of the vein of the book-loving, cultured policeman who doesn't quite fit in with every other policeman in the department. At first, I was a little bit put off by this because I'm kind of getting sick of this cliche, but I think Garcia Rosa pulls this off well by the end of the book. So what follows is a little bit of a predictable story as Espinoza tracks down what actually happens. And of course, he's thrown off by the fact that the money, the gun, and the note are gone. And of course, that money and that evidence goes through several hard twists and turns throughout the book as various characters get involved and the money changes hands. Now, I don't want to give too much away of the second half of the book because that's really where I think the book gains its footing. And that's really what saves this book, and it's a hit. Now, as I said before, I actually enjoyed this character and this writer a bit more than I did Gage. And if I was forced to pick a series character to follow in this Brazilian noir tradition, I would go with Detective Espinoza and Garcia Rosa's writing. So for me, this one is a hit.
Awesome. Well, my single selection for this time around is Sao Paulo Noir. We've talked about it. And we've talked about the editor, Tony Bellotto, but let me tell you a little bit more. This was put out by Akashic Books in 2018. Like I said, Bellotto is the author, or the editor, and also an author of one of the stories. He is a Brazilian rock star and best-selling novelist. I'd call this a good collection, though it's a slight step down from the powerhouse that is Lagos Noir. Again, this might be an issue of translation. I am definitely of the camp that in the translation of literary text, even the best translator, in this case, a guy named Clifford E. Landers, something must be lost in translation. But you can't put your finger on it unless you know both. So, I read quite a few stories from this collection. These are some of my favorites. Tony Bellotto plays with form in his story, Useless Diary, which is a missing person case set to the backdrop of John Lennon's assassination by Mark Chapman in 1981. I thought it was a cool style. I like the stories that use epistolary writing or diary entries as a literary device, and Bellotto does that well, I think, in this one. Another story I really liked, is called Margot by Drazio Varela, and it chronicles the flee-by-night escape and rags-to-riches story of a small-town woman who falls into prostitution and beyond to get by in a world that offers her little else. This is an eye-opening, compassionate look at the hard lives that women face when they are without means and without hope. And it's a sort of a clever and compact story that ends interestingly, and I just was riveted from start to finish. One other story that I thought I'm not sure if I loved it, but it was definitely weird. It was Olivia Mai's Coffee Stain, which is, for me, a very trippy story, but also beautifully written. I wouldn't be surprised if Olivia was a literary writer. And it's about a woman who may or may not have been named Lena, who drinks coffee and may or may not have a knife and may or may not have killed somebody. This piece plays with a literary monologue in a way that I thought was interesting, clever, and it's a fun kind of experiment that I think short stories are good for. I definitely recommend the collection if you want to get a sense of what Brazil's doing, at least in Sao Paulo, in the past few years. So that's all I got for you.
All right. Well, I wasn't quite prepared to do a review of this one, but I'm going to try to give you a quick review of Rio Noir. And I am just going to look at the list of titles here. It's from the same editor as Sao Paulo Noir. And for me, as you said, I read both Rio Noir and Sao Paulo Noir, and these didn't grab me like Lagos Noir, but they weren't bad. So if you wanted a taste of a Brazilian crime fiction, I think either one of these would suit you. I sort of felt, having read both, that they were both about of the same quality. Actually, one that stuck out for me, I believe it's from our editor, Tony Bellotto. Is that correct?
Yeah.
This one just sticks with me because it was humorous. It made me laugh a little bit. And that one is a story called Toned Cougars. This is a story of a younger guy who, well, he's basically something of a gigolo on the beaches of Rio. And he toys with older women and gets money out of them, well, by being a gigolo. By the end of the story, he's conned into to something by an older woman that he falls very hard for. And I'll leave that up to you as a reader to find out exactly what that is. But I really did enjoy that one, and it did stick with me. There weren't really any duds in this collection. So, like I said, Rio Noir, not a bad all-around experience to take a look at Brazilian noir. My last review is for a book mentioned on the podcast already, and that's In Praise of Lies, and that's by Patricia Mello. This came out in 1998 from Bloomsbury Paperbacks, and it is something of a parody novel. And we mentioned how that element of parody and satire is a characteristic of Brazilian crime fiction. And this one is also a parody of the crime fiction, especially the straight-to-paperback type of writing. Jose Guber is a mystery writer, and he's a writer of straight-to-paperback originals, and they're mostly ridiculous knockoffs of relatively well-known classics where he just puts a little bit of a spin on it.
You're dying.
Yeah, I had something go down the wrong throat.
Wow, you have two throats?
I have three, but all right. While researching a book, he falls in love with Melissa, who is an expert on poisonous snakes. Together, they concoct a scheme to kill her husband with the perfect crime. Of course, it involves him getting bit by a snake. What could go wrong?
Nothing.
At times, this book is really ridiculous, but is also a great critique of the genre. And one of the things that it does that I enjoyed is throughout the book, you see this correspondence between Jose and his various publishers, where he pitches ridiculous book ideas and they have a back and forth. That's extremely entertaining, as is his progression from being a lowly author of knockoff crime fiction books to a best-selling author of self-help, vaguely religious or cultish books that make him an international sensation. It's a short, quick read. It's entertaining. If you're not a fan of satire, avoid this one, but if you've maybe read a little bit too much crime fiction and you could use something that pokes fun of the genre, In Praise of Lies would be a good choice. For me, it's a snake bite to the ankle.
That one sounds exciting. I think I will go for that one.
Well, I can always send you that one in the mail.
Maybe for the holidays. Coming up in future episodes, we're done with this one. So we're one last stop before we go back to the United States. We're going to spend episodes 40 and 41 in Mexico City with Ignacio Paco Taibo's An Easy Thing. That's the name of the book. It's the second of his Hector Belascoren Shane detective novels, and it's the first one that was published in English. So, An Easy Thing, get it, read it, we'll talk about it. Episodes 42 and 43 are going to both be devoted to Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, a little sci-fi noir to start off 2020, which sounds very much like the future. Episode 44 and 45 we're going to spend with some good old classic hard-boiled men's adventure noir crime fiction. So going back to the roots of the genre a little bit with The Hunter by Richard Stark, which is the pseudonym for Donald E. Westlake. I know some folks have asked us if we're going to ever do Westlake, and here we are doing it. So that's that for now. How do they contact us, Kurt? Do you have a voice?
I do have a voice, and I will use it. If you want to get in touch with the show, you can find us on Facebook at Point Blank Hardboiled Noir Detective Fiction. You can send us an email, which is probably the best way if you have a specific question or comment. That's pointblanknoir@gmail.com. You can also tweet at us at pointblanknoir.
All right, spread the word. Give us ratings on iTunes. Tell your friends. Make pictures with our names on it and plaster them with wheat paste all over your neighborhood. Until then, we'll see you next time.
Have a good, probably Happy New Year by the time this episode comes out. We will see you in the future.
Cheers.
Point Blank is under a Creative Commons license. Music is by Justin. Copywritten works are property of their respective holders.